Now, we've all heard of the amazing stories that came out of the Great Migration. The Harlem Renaissance, the Chicago Renaissance, and even the Civil Rights Movement, just to name a few. Not to mention the economic gains in finding work in factories and other institutions across the North and Midwest. Poverty rates dropped, education and employment rates increased, and overall prosperity for Black Americans were up. However, Black and white Americans were still segregated at this time, largely still only convening on the basis of direct mutual benefit, like working in factories. Now, with millions of Black Americans living in the North, Du Bois had a larger audience to spread his philosophy to. Given all of the economic prosperity attained by Black Americans at the time, it was easy for men and women like Du Bois to attribute those gains to social integration and civil rights. Instead of doubling down on the work ethics, values, and beliefs they brought with them from the South, Black Americans largely started to abandon it for what I call Northern culture. While Southern culture was rooted in self-sufficiency and ownership, Northern culture was rooted in gaining resources from and access to the government and greater white society and using that for Black advancement. Since white Americans outnumbered Black Americans up north, they largely viewed these migrants like invaders into their communities. This perception, of course, translated into segregated communities, schools, churches, businesses, etc. White and Black men were competing for jobs in ways they weren't in the South due simply to their proximity to the factories in the North and Midwest. Du Bois even pushed for integrated labor unions instead of Black workers creating their own. This competition for jobs, especially in the post-war time, led to exponentially high amounts of racial violence. Needless to say, integration wasn't showing all of the benefits that Du Bois and others promised. As we all know, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows down south either. In fact, it was the complete opposite in many, many cases. When it came to income, education, employment, living conditions, and overall quality of life, Southern Black Americans were struggling. Jobs that were almost exclusively occupied by Black men, like barbering, carpentry, and masonry, were now being taken by white men who saw how lucrative the jobs were. Compound that with the racist laws, lynchings, and domestic terrorism from white lynch mobs, it's no wonder why so many Black Americans migrated north in the first place. Despite this, plenty of Black Americans believed in their ability to prosper in the region and stayed. We know this partly due to the Southern members of the National Negro Business League. One of the things that I noticed when looking over the proceedings of the National Negro Business League convention was the amount of Black men who spoke about the state of Black Americans in the South. They encouraged emigration back to the South by sharing success stories of their businesses. We can infer this by speech titles such as Negro Business Enterprises in Pensacola, Florida, Negro Enterprises in Enfield, North Carolina, and The Negro of the South and What Shall We Do to Be Saved. The NNBL being the brainchild of Booker T. Washington, their Southern chapter leaders and members often echoed his sentiment in Black Americans casting down their buckets in the South, which is probably one of the reasons why they held their first convention in Boston, Massachusetts. Speaker after speaker highlighted the achievements being made by Black Americans all over the country, but especially in the South. In J.C. Leftwich's speech, The Negro of the South and What Shall We Do to Be Saved, he not only details the problem, but also the solution of the conditions of the Southern Black American. He says the following, quote, "When it comes to the matter of unskilled labor, the Negro of the South will hold his own for many generations to come. This prophecy is based upon the fact that he will work longer for less money than any class of people on this side of the globe. He can live in any kind of hole and call it a house. He can stand more heat, can, with grace, submit to more insults than any race that God has made, without showing the least spirit of resentment. You cannot starve the Negro in the South. This element of our race is more than apt to be here many moons and eke out a pitiable existence." End quote. Leftwich offered solutions to this by saying, quote, "Now what solution have I to offer? In the first place, the Negro cannot make any substantial progress as long as he is entirely dependent upon the white man for everything. He must enter more and more into the commercial life of the nation. There is where he will find the filthy lucre. It is there he will find independence. It is there our boys and girls fresh from school may find employment congenial to their tastes." End quote. He goes on to highlight the use of group economics by saying, quote, "Ours is a struggle for bread and butter. To sum up the situation, my solution is healthy cooperation along all lines of business. End quote. Leftwich ended his speech by letting the attendees know that he was building a town in Alabama he named Klondike and encouraged them to move there to help its development. He said, quote, "Let us not despair. If you young men of color here in Massachusetts, in Boston, the hub of the universe, are not given a man's chance in business, I would advise you to come to Alabama. The harvest is plenteous, but the laborers are few." End quote. These open invitations from industry leaders and town builders were a consistent theme in the NNBL's proceedings all the way into the 1940s and 50s. The way many of them viewed it was, if you were successful up north, expand your success down south, and if you were failing up north, you could find success down south. Despite these petitions, Northern culture kept growing in popularity as more and more Black Americans migrated. The media played a huge role in the move up north as well. Founder and editor of the Chicago Defender, Robert S. Abbott, was one of the most influential figures that advocated for Black Americans to migrate to Chicago by sharing Black American success stories in the city. Likewise for the founder and editor of the Richmond Planet, John Mitchell, and the founder of the Pittsburgh Courier, Edwin Nathaniel Halston. W.E.B. Du Bois also advocated for the move, as we know. According to the National Bureau of Economic Research, Du Bois urged Southern migrants to, quote, "pour into the open doors of mine and factory," end quote, while European immigrants remained low in the North. During World War I, industrial production increased, and with that, the demand for labor. Many of these jobs were filled by Southern Black men who migrated to Northern and Midwestern cities to work in factories and mills. Now, when it comes to moving north, mainstream histories highlight all of the things that Black Americans gained. However, not many people speak on what Black Americans lost by leaving the South and assimilating into Northern culture. Not only that, are we really sure that Black Americans actually fared better up north? You may or may not be surprised to know this, but no, they didn't. Well, at least not on the macro. In fact, in most cases, Black migrants were at a more of an economic disadvantage than Black Americans who stayed in the South. Don't believe me? Let's take a look.